Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Lunchtime Conversation. My name is Ann Mason. I am the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. The Antiquarian Society's mission is to preserve and share local history, and we're delighted to do that virtually with you through these programs. If you're interested in other conversations that we've had, they are on our website, plymouth-antiquarian.org/lunchtime-conversations. And this program is being recorded and will be added to that site later this week. I want to acknowledge that this program is supported by a grant from the Bridge Street Fund, which is a special initiative of Mass Humanities, and Mass Humanities is supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council. So without their support, we would not be able to bring you local history virtual programming as we've been able to do. I also want to acknowledge all of our wonderful community businesses and organizations who are partnering with us through our corporate sponsorship program. And they are providing invaluable support for all of our events this season. Now, before we begin, I do want to introduce our guest for today. I'm delighted to have Kathryn Tarleton join us for this lunchtime conversation as we go behind the scenes into our historic clothing and textile collection. Kate is a textile conservator, and she is co-owner of Context Inc., which she founded in 2001 with Charlotte Hamlin. And Context Inc. works with both private and institutional clients, offering comprehensive conservation services for historic textiles, costume, contemporary fiber art, and all sorts of other things, from full conservation surveys to the treatment of individual pieces. And Kate is joining us to highlight some of the work that she's done for the Antiquarian Society in recent years on some of our dresses, and then most recently on a historic needlework sampler. So we're going to walk through those different pieces and have a chance to look at them as artifacts that reveal things about the past, and also to talk about how we care for them and what do conservators do, and what you can do if you have historic clothing or textiles in your family collections or personal collections. And I will say we are taking questions. If you're on the Zoom webinar, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature, which should be available at the bottom of your screen, or you can send them via the chat feature. If you're watching the Facebook stream, then feel free to send them in as a comment as well, and we'll monitor those throughout the program. All right, so as we have provided these lunchtime conversations, we really wanted to highlight some of the sort of behind the scenes of our historic collections here at the Antiquarian Society. And a large part of our collection is made up of historic clothing and textiles. And often we get the question, well, why does the Antiquarian Society have so many things in their collection that are made of cloth, made of fabric? And that really points to the work and the interests of one of the very instrumental people in the Society's early history. So the Society was founded in 1919 to save what we call the Hedge House from demolition. And the founders were all women, and they were particularly interested in everyday domestic life in the past. And this included not only collecting objects that would have been in the Hedge House in the 19th century, and then in the Harlow House, which was the second house we acquired in the 17th century, but also to think about how you would use those objects, how you would make food and cook on an open hearth and make clothes and all sorts of things like that. And the photograph I have up on our screen is of Rose Briggs, who was our first curator, and her mother was one of our founders, and she was really involved with the Antiquarian Society from the very beginning, and in the 1920s was instrumental in forming our collection. And so her particular interest was in historic costumes and clothing. And she really became an expert, a well-respected, known person in the field, not just here in Plymouth, but known outside of Plymouth as an expert, particularly on Pilgrim history, on Plymouth history, and on clothing. And so she, I think, is one of the primary reasons why we have so many textiles in our collection, because that was an interest of hers. And you can see her here on the large loom in the Harlow House, which is no longer there. But she was, again, part of this hands-on approach to history. So it wasn't just about collecting textiles, but also learning how to make, how would you weave in earlier generations. So that's a little bit of an overview of, why we have textiles. In many historical societies, they had founders who had an interest in historic clothing and textiles. And I think all of us can respond to that interest as well. I know it's something very, very tangible about having a dress from the past that someone wore, and even especially if it's someone in your family, and you can think about maybe items that you have saved, your wedding dress, for example. Sometimes those are the things that get saved. And so sometimes those are the things that get collected by historical societies like ours. So currently we have about 5,000 pieces of historic clothing in our collection. And that's not only just, dresses and for the gentlemen, military uniforms. We also have a lot of dress accessories. So things like hats and footwear. We also have parasols, canes, hair ornaments, all sorts of things that people would use as part of their entire costume of the day. And we also have textile furnishings, quilts, coverlets, and needlework collection. And we'll talk about one of our samplers at the end of this program. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can actually, you can all see us and get a better look at who's talking. Kate, so you've sat there patiently while I have talked about PIS and all of that, but welcome and thank you so much for doing this webinar for us today.
Thank you for inviting me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to start off by saying is what a textile conservator does, because a lot of people don't really quite understand how we fit in to the larger scene of historic societies or museums. And basically, the practice of conservation is concerned with the preservation of cultural property. And that's sort of a big tent word. In the case of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, the cultural property is everything from the Hedge House and Harlow House themselves, the buildings, down to all of the objects that are in the collection. And conservators tend to specialize in different media, like you have people who focus on paper or wood or metal. And in my case, it's textiles, which generally includes historic clothing, and then what we call flat textiles, like samplers, quilts, that sort of thing. But it's also all those costume accessories you mentioned too, and pieces of embroidery, pieces of lace, textile fragments. So, as I said, what we do is preserve them, but we do that in different ways. Professional conservators do a lot of what I'll call active treatment, which is things like specialized cleaning and repair, stabilization of individual objects. And in the case of costume and textiles, we do a lot of exhibition preparation, which means getting these things ready to go on display. Because if you think about textiles and costume, they have no internal means of support. You can take an antique chair and set it on a pedestal and there it is. But a quilt or a sampler or a dress needs some kind of support to show it properly. So that is everything from mount making and building to mannequins and torso forms and all of that kind of thing that we're involved with. And then I would say there's also what we think of as preventative conservation, and this is where people can do this stuff at home. If you have any sorts of family pieces or pieces you've collected, and that involves things like controlling the humidity, the relative humidity and temperature of where things are kept or where things are exhibited, controlling light levels, using archival materials for storage, properly storing things, storing them in the right place. And as we go through today, I'll give pointers for those kind of things, but there are things that you can actively do at home to better care for the pieces that you have. So I suppose what we were going to do is, do you want to talk about the sort of the idea behind the 3 dresses being on part of the wedding exhibit? And
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we way back in 2017, which sounds like a long time ago, given everything that's happened since then, but Pilgrim Hall Museum, which is one of the institutions here in Plymouth, and we partner with them for a lot of different programs and initiatives, and they held a wedding dress exhibit in 2017. That was a temporary exhibit, but they gathered together all sorts of wedding dresses and tried to represent, I believe the vision was 1 dress at least from each decade, from the 17th century, or as much as you could go, as far as you could go back. I think they had a reproduction to represent the 17th century, but we contributed an 18th century dress that we'll look at, and then they went from there to try to up to the present to see the evolution in in changes to wedding costume and just looking at some of these remarkable exhibits from Plymouth County. So not just from Plymouth, but other historical organizations, the Situate Historical Organization, all sorts of smaller institutions that had wedding dresses were able to lend them to Pilgrim Hall for that exhibit. And so the Antiquarian Society lent quite a number of them, and the 2 that we'll be looking at today required some conservation work in order to stabilize them or prepare them for exhibition. And then the 3rd dress that we'll talk about was shown not at Pilgrim Hall, but at the Hedge House right down the street, but at the Antiquarian Society's own exhibit. We had a very much smaller scale exhibit of that wedding dress, and we're able to highlight that bride in particular, who we have a wonderful provenance for that dress. So we'll talk a little bit about her when we get to her. But so that was the impetus between these 3 treatments that were done on these 3 dresses. So let me pull up our slideshow again, and then we can get right to it. So I'll let you, Kate, take it away from here.
Sure. So what I'm going to do is, she mentioned these 3 different dresses, and I'll talk a little bit about, rather than go in detail about every single thing that we had to do to get these on exhibit, I'm just going to point out interesting individual aspects of the 3 different ones. And also just start off by saying that, there's, whether it's a quilt or a dress or any other textile, conservators have sort of a standard procedure of how they go about starting a conservation project, which the very first one is a very thorough examination. So in that examination, we look at the object very closely to determine what materials it's made of, the fibers, whether it's silk, cotton, or wool, or increasingly more manufactured fibers as 20th century pieces get worked into historic collections. You need to understand what the materials are, how it's made, what the construction methods are, how it's put together, what changes it has gone through over time. I'll say that it's really a rare historic piece of clothing that has not had either an alteration or an addition or repairs, or been sort of mucked about in some manner, whether for good or for ill. And once we have that information, then we look at the condition. And that's basically things like tears and rips and, structural issues, seams that have been taken apart or areas of weakness, those kinds of things, and stains and different types of soils, mildew issues, all of the kind of condition issues that need to be treated before it can go on exhibit. So, and once we have that information, then we come up with a treatment plan about basically what to do to then get it from the point it's being there on the exam table so it can go up onto a mannequin. And I'll say that was the goal for all three of these, as Anne has already said, was to put them on exhibition for this particular, well, one at Hedge House, but the other two at Pilgrim Hall for the wedding exhibit. So this is the first one. And Anne, did you want to say something about the owner or the original wearer of the dress?
Right. So this dress, we believe, was worn by Deborah Whitworth when she married Gideon White of Plymouth. And Gideon White was a descendant of Peregrine White. Peregrine White is famous for being the child born on board the Mayflower. And Gideon, his descendant, was born in 1752, and he and Deborah were married in 1787. And as we understand it, Deborah was actually the daughter of Miles Whitworth, who was a surgeon in the British Army. And so we have a loyalist dress right here. So this is obviously in the period of the American Revolution. And so Deborah's father and her husband, Gideon White, were loyalists. And Gideon actually became a captain in the British Army and afterwards settled in Nova Scotia, as many loyalists did. And so we're not actually certain how this dress ended up coming back to Plymouth. So Gideon White is he's from a Plymouth family. He lived here, but he leaves Plymouth. And we're not sure if maybe one of his descendants, one of Gideon and Deborah's descendants, kept it in Nova Scotia and eventually it came back, or we just don't know. It was actually donated by a Morgan family member in the 1920s. So you can actually see from our accession number is 1923.16. All of our collection objects have accession numbers, which help us track them. And they usually begin with a year, and that year tells us when it came into the collection. So our organization was founded in 1919, and then in 1923, so pretty early on, we received this dress into the collection. So that's what we know about it. And I will say that the petticoat that it's shown with here, you can see the blue coming through at the center. That's not the original petticoat to this dress, but it was felt that it was it would show well together with these two pieces. So I think that was all I have on that.
Okay, so we can look at the next slide. I think is the back view, right?
Yep.
So this is a pretty typical example of late 1780s dress form, with that open front so the petticoat shows, and the very full skirt. And so here it is on exhibition at Pilgrim Hall. But if you look at the next slide, this is how I started out with it. And this is it on the exam table. This is where I, as I said before, go about figuring out the materials, construction. It's all hand stitched, obviously, since it's an 18th century dress. But there are some additions to it, which I'll get to. But one of the more interesting things about this is still a bit of a mystery. And what you can see from this slide is how the color changes throughout the fabric. It's not faded. It's not fading because of light exposure, which is the usual reason you have color change. And we know that because only certain colors are affected, not all of them. And it's a very irregular pattern. So basically we're starting off with a mystery. I don't really know what caused the color change, but it's sort of an interesting factor about this. So if we go to the next slide, we can see there on the far left a detail of the fabric. The upper part of the image shows the bright blue and yellow and the original colors. And the lower part of that far left image shows the change. And again, on the middle and the right side of the screen, the two upper images show very close-up detail of the weave structure with the bright blue and bright yellow silk yarns in the weave. And those have changed, if you look at the lower images, just sort of a grayish white color. But what was not affected was the red and the black colors. And that is what's so unusual about this, is that usually red is one of the first things to fade. And the other thing is there's no apparent difference in the condition of the fibers either. They are not visibly weaker or more brittle or anything in the part that has changed color. So, as I said, it's a mystery which could probably be solved with some more intense research that was beyond the scope of this project, but there are imaging processes that you can go through to determine more about the chemistry behind this. But anyway, that was sort of a unique aspect of this dress. But if we look at the next slide, this is a close-up of the bodice before it was treated. And on the upper left, those yellow arrows are pointing to pretty typical issues we deal with. Those were areas where the stitching was broken or the fabric was weak or abraded. And that's just from being worn. I mean, those are stress points on any garment. And those are the sort of things that needed to be repaired before it could be exhibited, because even small areas of, broken stitching can quickly become very large areas of broken stitching if something is put onto a mannequin in an unstable condition. So that's sort of typical stuff that needs to be stabilized. But the picture on the lower right shows the bodice open. That's the inside of the bodice. And all of these, what look like stripes, are bones that have been stitched into the inside of the bodice. But those are a much later addition. This dress originally would have been worn over a set of stays, like a corset to hold the torso in a very firm position. And the dress itself only has one baleen bone going down the center back. But this is what I meant when I said often historic garments have additions. And we don't know exactly why, since it was donated in 1920, why somebody stitched these bones in here, but it was probably so it could be worn for some event, either to commemorate some historic thing, or it could have just been fancy dress-up party time, which was not at all uncommon to take historic garments and wear them for various occasions. In this case, these bones aren't causing any harm. They're not putting stress on the original garment. We decided to leave them in place because they are part of the history of the dress now. The dress has an evolving history. It's not just frozen in time. So yeah, those stayed. And if we look at the next slide, and this is just a close-up detail of the sort of repair work that was done. This was right at the very back of the neck. And again, it's just a little bit of a tear, a little bit of loose stitching. That bone that was added in is open at the top and could protrude out. And so on the right side image just shows after everything was stitched back in place. A little piece of twill tape was used to cap off the bone. That's the kind of work that has to happen before it can go on a mannequin, so these don't become larger problems during handling an exhibition. So that's, if we look at the next one, this is the final sort of point of interest for this, because the thing about conservation is we do our job best if nobody even knows we did it. When you go to an exhibition, you don't see any of this stuff. And what is going on here is originally the front opening of this bodice would have been pinned. That's how the original wearer would have worn it. But we can't, when we're putting this on a dress form or a mannequin, we can't pin it or stitch it down the center front through the original silk, because that would put too much stress on the silk, because it fits fairly firmly over the mannequin. So instead, we devised what is called a slotted way to secure the front. And these solid blue silk strips that you see were hand stitched along the inside of the bodice. And then the detail that you see on the bottom here shows those two slots of silk, or pieces of silk, that fit together like a tongue and groove. When you butt the bodice edges together, those slot together. And when it's on the mannequin, you can stitch straight down between the edges of the actual original bodice, but stitch through the blue silk that I stitched to it. So that is what is taking the pressure and the stress and holding everything together, but it's invisible and there's no stress on the original silk fabric, which you might not have followed that whole thing. But the point is, the additional little placket that's on there is what is holding it together. So there's no additional wear and tear put on the original fabric. So I think if we move on, we have the second dress that we looked at.
Well, Kate, we do have a question. So we have a question about how someone in the 18th or 19th century would maintain these items. So looking at this dress, and obviously we can, even before it gets to it, it's had generations of people who've owned it. But when they originally would have been wearing this, how would they have maintained it? And I know you mentioned that this is silk. So how would they have washed silk, for example, or would they have washed it?
They would not have. And as you can, if you look at the back in these two upper images, you can see sort of a line along the upper back where the neck opening is. Those are sweat stains. And the lining is linen. And even though the original wearer would have had a few more layers on underneath of it, she wouldn't have worn this against her skin. You're still going to get perspiration coming through. And clothing was, a dress such as this would have been aired out. It would have been brushed, but it would not have been laundered in the way that we think of either hand washing it or throwing it in the washing machine, obviously. Areas could be spot cleaned if they got dirt on them, but things such as this were not regularly laundered. Linen underclothing, your chemise, and that sort of thing would have been hand washed, but not a dress such as this.
And then we had a second question about the blue silk pieces that you added, and if that is a slip stitch, or how did you affix them?
I think it's herringbone stitching.
Okay.
It's stitched to the linen flat lining in the bodice, because that is fairly robust, and it's stitched all along the length there, so it's it distributes the stress across the whole length, so it's not pulling from like just one or two points. So it's secure that way. And it's easily removable also. Right. Yeah.
Right. And as you mentioned, we don't want to do anything that's permanent if we can help it. If something can be reversed, that's good.
Most textile or most conservation treatments are designed so that they are reversible.
And I do think that you're right, Kate, that probably this was worn by members of the Antiquarian Society, quite likely for costume parties, which was one way of highlighting the collection, actually. You know, we still have members who remember those occasions, even in the 1950s when they would get costumes out from, you know, the 18th, 19th century, and they would fit them to different members, and they would have a little fashion show, and that might happen outside. So you have all sorts of stresses that are happening on these dresses, you know, and you know, some of those stains could have been from those occasions as well. You just don't know.
And the Plymouth Antiquarian Society is not alone in that practice. I mean, this is a widespread thing. It really wasn't until sometime after the mid-20th century that those practices were just stopped, and sort of a more, what we think of as a more professional approach was taken.
Right.
But yeah,
right.
There's a lot of use here.
Yep. All right, so for time's sake, we'll just keep moving on then. This is the second dress that we had Kate work on for that Pilgrim Hall exhibit. And as you can see, it's a much different style. So this was actually worn by Sarah Shippen when she married Arthur Lord of Plymouth. And so they were married on October 2nd of 1878. So we're nearly 100 years removed from Deborah Whitworth's wedding at this point. And the Lords lived at 24 North Street here in Plymouth. Arthur Lord was president of the Pilgrim Society. He was a lawyer. He was very active in Plymouth local politics, as well as with everything that happened for the Pilgrim Tercentenary in 1920, the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrim arrival. So the Lords were an important family in Plymouth in the 20th century. And I don't know as much about Sarah Shippen Lord. I do know that she is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery here in Plymouth. She was born in 1856 and she died in 1952. And the other thing I know about her is that she was an anti-suffragist. So last year we were commemorating 100th anniversary since the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And Mrs. Arthur Lord, or Sarah Lord, is one of the women who come up frequently on lists of women who opposed extending the right to vote to women. So they were, you know, an interesting dynamic couple here in Plymouth, and certainly well established in terms of their social connections, and financially they were, I think, rather well off as well. So that's the origin of this dress.
Well, yes, and before we turn to the next one, you can see it's a separate bodice and skirt. She had her political views, but she was also very fashionable. Here she has, this is a very good example of a sort of asymmetrically trimmed late 1870s dress. You can see that both sides of the skirt look different, and when we get further on, you can see how the back is very different too. So this whole asymmetry thing was very much in vogue. So if we look at the next one, here's the bodice. And, you know, this is, I don't need to spend much time on this other than to say it's, you know, it again had typical issues. All of these numbers are pointing to either areas of broken stitching, which tend to be on stress points, because, you know, this is the era when clothing fit like upholstery. I mean, these things were very firmly encased the body. And then some of these rather elaborate trims also were just rumpled from storage or loose or needed to be retacked in place and that sort of thing. So the bodice itself didn't have any major issues. But if we move to the next slide, the skirt really did. And in addition to this, there was an extra piece of fabric that was stored with the dress that it's unclear if it was ever part of the dress, or we couldn't figure out how it fit back onto the skirt. So it could have just been left over from the making of the skirt. But anyway, this, at the point where this was donated, it seems to be a work in progress of an alteration. The side seams were mostly unstitched. They were parts held together with straight pins. These two back panels, if you look at the lower right image, that cross over each other to form that back bustle around the waist, had been unstitched and flattened and were no longer attached at the waist, and it was sort of unclear how they fit in there. And there are many layers to this skirt too. If you look at the upper left image, that just shows the white muslin and flouncing underneath. There's also an underlining and an inner lining. So there's a lot going on in this skirt. But if we go to the next image, the upper image shows you sort of an idea of a lot of things going on in the waist area, things that had been removed, things that had been repaired. And I've talked about alterations and additions, but there are repairs that conservators sort of refer to Frankenstitching, sort of terrible, big, loose stitches that look like they were put to hold something together just for that night's party, you know. So this could have very well been worn for dress up. There were just a lot of things that don't look like normal kind of issues from something that was simply worn as clothing. In the lower image here shows the waist area partway through treatment. There was a lot of stitching reinforcement that had to go on in order to hold these heavy, heavy layers of skirt onto this waistband and make it possible to exhibit it. So if we look at the next one, this shows the skirt after, see these vertical side seams, after everything was put back in place. And that was done with a lot of very close studying of fold lines and stitch holes and basting marks, and basically putting the puzzle back together. And here's a good, this shows you the asymmetry, how one side is completely different from the other, which was very fashionable. And if we look at the next one, that's on the left, that's the front of the skirt, and on the right is the back with this fashionable sort of fishtail sort of bustle. And again, the upper panels there at the back waistline, we studied the crease lines and the stitch lines and literally matched up the stitching holes over each other to recreate what had been undone and left undone. So this is the closest we can get to what the original was. And that's sort of the detective work behind restabilizing a piece such as this. And there it is all together. And you can see how the bodice covers up that back waist area and sort of flows with all the various bits of trim. I mean, it's very similar to upholstery of the era, if you think of, and window treatments. It's like women as interior decor, you know?
Right, and to think of everything that had to go on underneath in order for a woman to have this shape outside, right? You know.
Oh yes, I mean, she would have had on pretty major foundation garments to form her body into the correct shape, but then also to support the weight of that skirt and the bustle and the train and all of that. So yeah, we'll see a little bit of that with the next dress that we talk about.
Right. And I should note, since we're, you know, this is obviously not a white wedding dress, and many of us are used to thinking of wedding dresses as being white. And of course, that was one thing that the Pilgrim Hall exhibit was so wonderful in showing, that, you know, it really wasn't until pretty recently that the predominant wedding color became white. I mean, I know sometimes we look back to Queen Victoria and her wedding in the earlier part of the 19th century, and she wore white, and that sort of set off a fashion for that. But here in the 1870s, you know, this is clearly a blue wedding dress, and it would have been used, right? I mean, it's not as though even a family who could afford a lavish wedding, they would still be using anything like that. I mean, Kate, can you speak to that a little bit? Like how expensive would this dress have been, or
Well, I can't put a dollar amount on it,
yeah.
But it would have been, yes, this is beyond the means of your middle class person.
Yeah.
I did not see a maker's label on the inside, but then again, they aren't always there, and the inside bodice interior waistband is often where they are, and that had been cut, so it's possible that it was just missing. It's also possible this could have been made by a local dressmaker or someone in the family. I don't know enough about their history. But it is true that we have this current sort of idea that you wear your wedding dress once and that's it, and it's this sacred object, but that wasn't the case. It would have been worn, the trim could have been changed. I mean, there was a lot of redoing even among upper classes during this period. You know, trims could be changed or accessories. So it's this idea of the precious white wear it once only wedding dress has kind of evolved through time to where we are now, but not so much in the 19th century.
Right. And I do have a question specific to this dress. If the Lords, Artha and Sarah Shippen Lord, were married in Plymouth, and actually, I don't know that. I know that I'd have to look that up. So maybe if I can find that answer, I'll add it to the notes for this recording, just so we can resolve that question. But I'm not sure where they were married. So maybe we should, on that note, with an unanswered question hanging over our head, we'll move on to the next dress. And this is the dress that we exhibited at the Hedge House. So I know some of you probably saw it there, but this was worn by Alice Walker on September 30th, 1880, when she married Edward Watson. And it remained in the family's keeping until Bonnie Hobson, who was an Antiquarian Society member, actually gave it to us in 2015. So it stayed in the family for its whole history. And Bonnie is actually the couple's great granddaughter. So, you know, she had a direct tie to this dress, and she knew exactly who wore it and when. Alice, the original owner, grew up in the Boston Highlands neighborhood of Roxbury, which at that time was actually an independent city, and it was not annexed by Boston until 1868. And her grandfather was actually one of the mayors of Roxbury in the 1850s. Her father was a successful businessman, but it seems that after her father's death, she and her mother and her sister probably fell on some more difficult times, and they ended up moving out of Roxbury and down to Scituate. And we think it must have been this move to the South Shore that introduced her or provided the opportunity for her to meet Edward Watson. And it's interesting that he did not share her cosmopolitan or privileged background. So she had, you know, been raised in a family with a lot of wealth and in right there in the Boston area. But Watson was actually born in Plymouth, and he lived on Clark's Island. And so we know that in 1880 in the census, he's actually listed as living in his brother's home and working as a farm laborer. So it seems like these two were from just totally different worlds. He was 44 when they got married, and Alice was 29. We're not sure, you know, if she, again, had suffered such a financial catastrophe with her father's death that she was looking for a husband anywhere, or perhaps they really had a very significant, special, you know, relationship, and it could be that it was a love match. There's just so much we don't know, and that there's so many things that we would love to speculate on and try to figure out, you know, how these people found each other and what their relationship actually was. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that the families on Clark's Island were by no means illiterate. They were some of the most interesting people, I think, in Plymouth's history. The Watsons and the Goodwins and others connected to them were part of this extended transcendental circle. So in the middle of the 19th century, they were connected with Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so, you know, there's this, they're very, very interesting people to read about, and sort of the conversations that must have taken place at their extended dining room tables over the years. So in any case, that is where this dress comes from. And I think it really speaks more to Alice's background in Roxbury than to, you know, it seems a little bit out of place for maybe a Clark's Island wedding. But again, on the other hand, you know, there are a lot of connections there that these families had with the more cosmopolitan world. So I don't want to slam Clark's Island. I think it's actually funny that Edward Watson is listed as a farm laborer, which I think he was probably much more than what we would think of as what would a farm laborer do. But in any case, a lot of questions there to be answered. But certainly this is a wonderful dress in our collection because we do have that clear provenance. We know its story and we know who wore it. And that's why we chose to display it.
Well, the dress, it holds some mysteries also. It's luckily, it was in really structurally sound condition. There was very little actual conservation that had to be done to it. So it's been cared for. And you're right, it's very polished. It's very high quality construction. But again, inside the interior, there's no maker's label, and the interior waistband it's not the original. So, you know, we can't really trace it that way. It has been changed a bit from when it was originally worn in 1880. And one of the things that we can see right away when we look at the sleeves, and here it is just flat on the exam table, is that poking out of the right sleeve, you can see a little bit of lace, but over there on the proper left sleeve, you don't see any lace. So if we look at the next slide, what we see, this is before I've done anything, you see a view of inside each of these sleeves. And again, this is an alteration or a change that was never completed because they do not match. But what I was able to determine was, if you look at the image on the left, it just kind of looks a little blurry there in the center. What that is are fragments of some silk tulle, like silk netting, just enough there to determine that those are fragments of undersleeves that would have been stitched inside, and that's what the lace was originally stitched to. And I can follow along the stitch lines and a little tiny bit of silk fragments to figure that out. And they have pretty much deteriorated, but there's enough there to give me that information and to show that the lace would have protruded out about 1.5 inches to show under that flouncing. So we repositioned the lace to reflect its original positioning, because something had to happen because it was asymmetrical. So if we look at the next slide, so that was, you'll see that on the final on display picture. But I just threw this in because this is a typical, there are always underarm stains and there's not much you can do about them. In this case, they're fairly minor, but the interesting thing is inside this dress were modern dress shields. This is an interior picture down here in the lower right. And they date from the 20th century. They're taped in there and they're made of some sort of manufactured material. And they're very crumpled and they're quite sharp creases. And so this is an example of a later edition that we documented by taking photos of and marking his position and then removed. Unlike the boning on that earlier 18th century dress, which was doing no harm. This was doing harm. We don't know the, well, first they were in the way of doing any sort of other treatment to the dress, but also we don't know the aging properties of these dress shields, so they could disintegrate and cause harm if left in place. So that's just sort of a typical issue. But if we look at the next one, I just wanted to kind of quickly say something about support, because I talked about how dresses have no, like, bodies without bones, they need support. And it's not a simple matter to put a historic dress onto a dress form or mannequin. The mannequin itself has to be exactly the right shape. And so we often start with these conservation grade foam torso forms, which you see on the far left here, which is kind of a standard modern body shape, which then we carve. You can literally carve out parts of it and then build up also with archival batting and to get the proper form. And here is the front view of, you know, the form on the left during the process in the middle, and then on the far right is the finished one. And you can see how I had to change the shoulder slope and also add padding to the hips and change the bust line. All of this is because 19th century silhouette is just very different from 20th. So if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, see, this is just the side view of that. And this is something conservators do a lot, is have to rework an existing form to fit a specific dress so you have the proper shape. And then if you go to the next slide, it shows, starting on the left, it has, I've attached a bustle pad and then this panel down the front to keep the skirt hanging properly. And in the middle, you have the petticoat over that. And then on the far right, you have the dress on over all of this, which is then fully supported and not under stress while it's on exhibit for, you know, however many weeks or months that it's on. So that's, again, part of that whole invisible work that goes on underneath that hopefully nobody notices, because you're supposed to be looking at the dress. But here you can see a couple of quite nice images that Anne has of it, with the, you know, the lace has been repositioned on the sleeves. The sleeves have fabric supports under them. Anyway, that it's on its new 19th century body here.
Yeah, it always is amazing what a difference it is between looking at something in a box and then looking at it on a mannequin, where it feels like it could start walking away, and you get a sense more of what it is supposed to look like on, you know, it's not the same as a human body, but it's as close as we'll get to that. Okay, so we have a couple of questions just before we leave the dresses. So one question is, was the fabric made in an English or a New England American mill? And then would the dress itself have been fabricated in New England? So
I don't have a definite answer for the dress is probably, or rather the silk is probably imported. Mm-hmm. And with her Boston connections, this very well could have been, it was made in New England. It wouldn't have been ordered from abroad. I'm sure it was made to fit her specifically. And it has undergone some alterations. That sort of poofy bustle you see on the back would have been a bit later. You can, on the inside of the skirt, you can see how it's been sort of reconfigured to make that bustle shape, because in 1880, it would have been flatter back there. But there being no maker label, we don't know who made it. Often those show where it was made. So those are sort of open questions. But it's very fashionable silhouette, and very finely stitched. So it was probably done by a dressmaker as opposed to at home.
Right. And then another question related to dresses is how would they have been stored? So in these different periods, you know, I think in our 18th century dress, you mentioned brushing the dress and airing it out. So would we have had hangers or hooks or?
Again, it depends. I think mostly trunks, mostly,
Trunks.
and yeah. There are a lot of historic dresses have hanging tapes stitched inside of them, but those were added by the historical societies and museums that collected them because that's how they had room for storage. But you know, we hang all our clothes, most of our clothes, and most objects such as these sorts of dresses would not have been hung. They would have been stored in trunks.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to our needlework sampler just because I don't want us to run out of time. And this is the most recent of all these items to come into our collection. It was donated last year by a descendant of the maker. And as you can see, this needlework sampler was worked by Lucia Harlow Holmes, who was born in 1807, and then we're not quite sure on her death date, actually. Some records say 1874, and then some records say 1884. So there's a 10-year gap there, and we're not quite sure which one to believe. But a project for future research as we continue to study the genealogy. But we do know that Lucia completed the sampler when she was 11, going on 12. So she mentions that she was in her 12th year. So she was 11 and she was heading towards 12. And what's really special about this sampler is not only that we know who worked it, we also know the date, so 1818. We know that she was from Plymouth, was living in Plymouth. Her father was Peter Holmes and her mother was Sally Harlow. And one reason this came to us is because she's a descendant of Sergeant William Harlow, who built the Harlow Old Fort House, which is one of the Antiquarian Society's houses. But also special about the sampler is that it lists her teacher. So it notes that she worked the sampler under the tuition of Lucia Ryder. And Ryder is another Plymouth family name, sometimes spelled with an I, R-I-D-E-R, and sometimes with a Y. But I've done a little bit of research. I'm not quite sure whether Lucia Ryder taught other girls how to do their stitching, or if she was a family friend and she was, teaching Lucia. The fact that they have the same name could be a coincidence, or it could be that there was a family connection. Lucia is a common Plymouth name. There are other families who used it as well. But I believe that this Lucia Ryder was born around 1798, so she would have been about 20 when she taught 11-year-old Lucia Holmes how to do the sampler. And she married Nathan Robbins in 1819, so just after the sampler was finished. And then sadly, she died in 1826 when she was 28. So she is buried on Burial Hill. And Lucia Harlow Holmes, who worked the sampler, had a longer life. So she actually married an Abraham Whitten of Plymouth. And as I mentioned, she died either 1874 or 1884, and she's buried in Vine Hill Cemetery in Plymouth. So both of the women whose names are on this piece lived in Plymouth and are buried in Plymouth, and we're hoping to uncover more information about their lives, as we're able to do more research. But Kate, why don't you share with us about this sampler from your perspective?
Yes. Now this is a really typical example of I've worked on lots of samplers, and they often come to me in this kind of condition, which is if not the original frame, at least an old frame. And the first step is to get it out of the frame for various reasons. This one, there's no glass on the front, no glazing material on the front. But we know that there was at one point, because there was actually a shard of glass embedded into the edge of the sampler from when it probably fell off the wall at some point. but then it was just put back up without the glass. So, so what you have is the front and the back. And what I want to say here is just to point out the reason it's important to remove a sampler and then rehouse it. Even if you want to reuse the original frame, you need to get the sampler in contact with archival materials rather than the situation it is here, which is, if you look at the back, that's a very acidified piece of cardboard, which is damaging the fibers in the sampler. So if we look at the next slide, this is the sampler front and back. Once it's out of the frame, this is very typical. It was glued to that piece of cardboard. So on the right-hand side image of the back of it, you can see fragments of paper and glue that are still attached. And I want to show, have you noticed here the color difference? Now this is fading. This is color change because of light exposure. The front of the sampler on the left is almost monochromatic. On the right, you can see pretty brilliant orange and yellow and different shades of green, which would have been the original colors that have been protected because they're inside the frame. So that's one of the issues with light exposure. It's cumulative and it's irreversible, unfortunately. You can't put color back in. So these are things to think about in your own collection if you're exhibiting textiles in your house. Is really the very first big thing is to protect them from direct light. And if they're in a frame, make sure the glazing on the front is UV protecting, or UV blocking rather, because that will really help. Because it's not just color that changes, it's also the fibers themselves can get very brittle. They break down because of photo degradation, and they can yellow and darken, which is what has happened here. And we should say this was also exposed to a lot of cigarette smoke over the years. So that's another issue with airborne pollutants. You don't want to hang something in your kitchen because of all the things that fly around in the kitchen when you're cooking, unless it's very well protected in a frame. But let's look at the next one. And so there wasn't a whole lot of treatment here, but I was able to do certain things. With very careful addition of humidification on the back, just very measured amounts of moisture, was able to remove the paper and adhesive residue from the back edges, and that's what you see before and after here. But then if we look at the next one, I was not able to do any wet cleaning to get rid of that yellowing because of the really fragile condition of many of the embroidery threads. And again, this is light damage. What you see here at the top is quite a close-up photo of the front of the sampler, the embroidery. And as you can see, those are silk threads, and they're brittle and they're broken and they're quite thin. And the exact same area here on the back, the lower image, those same threads are quite robust on the back where they were not exposed to light. They were just on the other side. But any kind of a wet treatment would literally wash those away, and we would lose material, and that's not, conservation is all about preserving the object, not irreparably changing its state. So sometimes the best treatment is no treatment. We did do very careful surface cleaning. So if you turn to the final slide here, we see the front and the back after it was treated, and it's improved, but this is a case of you can only do so much without causing damage. And it's certainly enough to, it's much more legible. It's now in an environment where it's supported on archival board as opposed to an acidified piece of cardboard or an old piece of wood. And as far as you know, tips for your own objects, there are ways of, it's possible to take a sampler such as this, remount it onto an archival backing, and even possibly reuse the antique or original frame if you want to keep the two together. You can put in archival barrier layers there so no further damage will be done. That sort of thing is possible to do. But as far as your own objects, controlling, having them housed in archival boxes or acid-free tissue or washed muslin, even well-washed old sheeting to wrap your quilt in, those are all ways of protecting an object from further damage, even if it already has some damage. And also keeping them stored or exhibited in areas that, the same areas of the house where you live, meaning don't put them in the attic and don't put them in the basement, because that's where you have extreme fluctuations in heat and humidity, which can cause damage over time, can promote mold growth and mildew. Textiles, they like to be in the same places we are. They're like, we don't like to be too hot or too cold or too humid. And the other thing they need if you're storing textiles is to have some air circulation around them. Don't just shove them all in a box under the bed to get dusty. They need to be elevated off the floor a bit. That keeps out pesky critters that may be wandering around. And so there's a lot of preventative measures, such as those, just basic good housekeeping is things to keep in mind when you're storing or exhibiting. But protecting things from light, I would say, is almost the number one when it comes to exhibiting. So there's so much more we could say, but
well, I know, and I think, obviously what a wonderful record each of these dresses and then the sampler is of a woman who maybe we don't have any other record of her life. In the case of Lucia Harlow Holmes, we have her gravestone, but this is something that she actually worked with her own hands, and it shows, it can tell us a lot about her life as 11-year-old in Plymouth and the things that she was learning. And, we have a verse on here from a hymn by Isaac Watts, the great 18th century hymn writer, and so, I mean, there's all sorts of ways we can look at the sampler and learn from it and discover something about life in the past. So I think it's incredibly valuable to us for that reason. And I think that's, don't be discouraged, if you've looked at your family sampler and realized that it's faded and it's, maybe it's having some of the same issues that this sampler had. It's still valuable, and it's a matter of, doing what we can now with the objects as we find them now, and hoping for continued preservation, in the future.
Yeah, and if I can just add my last big point I wanted to make was very closely related to that. A lot of old samplers just aren't very pretty,
Right.
I mean, they just aren't, but they are really valuable as historic documents, especially parts of your family. And that's the point I want to make, is document, document, document. Anne has introduced each of these pieces with family history that she has. And if you've got this family history swirling around in your head, write it down because it will be invaluable for future generations of your family to know this stuff and have it in a place where they can refer to it. Because I think of all those sad quilts you see in the antique mall, when you're there on a Sunday and they're just hanging there with some little price tag on them and no name and no history, and they've lost their story, is the thing. If you have a family story, even if it's a small one, connect it somehow to the pieces you have, because it's the story that makes them even more valuable to you. Because none of these things, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's not beautiful, but it's still really valuable, and it's part of your history. So.
Right, absolutely. Well, we have a few questions just as we wrap up. one question is, would you agree, besides preventative, no one except an expert should attempt to conserve them, should only professionals? So,
other than, well, yeah, cleaning, especially cleaning treatments, are fraught with, I mean, before any cleaning decisions are made, you have to do extensive testing of dye for dye bleed and dye fastness, and also just the you know, determine the brittleness or not of the you know, the structural stability of the fibers. So that is one of the trickiest things, because people always want to clean stuff because we're so used to washing things, and it can be disastrous. So consulting with the conservator is a very good idea on that, as well as you know, stabilization and repair. It's pretty specialized way of thinking about, I mean, it is sewing for the most part, but you have to think about tension, and you have to think about you know, how it's attached to something, and the materials that you use are very important too. They have to be tested, and you have to understand their aging properties. But there's a whole lot you can do preventative wise, and I've sent Anne a list of some really reliable online resources, because there's a whole lot of unreliable stuff you can find online, but these are good, solid places for information that she's going to send out and post.
yeah. Right, and this is sort of a related question is, when do you think, I think this is related to one of the dresses, but it could relate to the sampler, like how often does something have to be conserved? Or would you, you know, have you ever conserved the same sampler twice or the same dress twice? Have you ever had it in your care for treatment? Or is it usually something that can, with the proper storage, can last for years and years?
Hopefully one and done.
Yeah.
I do know of other objects that have had to be remounted and or cleaned, like, you know, 30 years later. And usually that was a result of either not the best exhibition practices over that time, or use. But yes, ideally, this is a one-time investment, and then if you follow up with care, that should be it.
Well, we are, so we're at almost 1:45. So I think we went over the time that we planned to take. I know that we, as Kate mentioned, I will be sharing out the recording and then that list of resources. And if we have a chance, I might drop in some of the other questions that might have come up that we'll try to get answers for, and provide a little more details on these objects. But Kate, did you have anything that you wanted to conclude with, or any final thoughts?
No, the documentation was my big point, but no, but I'm happy to, if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer those if you want to include those in some sort of a follow-up thing, because I know we're over time and people always have more questions, so I can do that with you.
Great. No, wonderful. Thank you so much for volunteering that. So we can just maybe compile those and then share them out. And if you have any other questions related to historic clothing or textiles, feel free to send them to me. And, you know, we have a survey that will pop up after you're done with the program, and you can add those questions right into the survey itself, and we'll see if maybe some of them will introduce another topic for future lunchtime conversations. We'll have to have you back, Kate, so that we can get them answered. But I will just say that we are scheduled to have another conversation Wednesday, June 9th at 12:30 p.m. And this one we're calling Our Favorite Things. So I will be joined by by Joyce Poremski, who is one of our docents here at the Hedge House, and she and I are going to be talking about some of our favorite objects in the collection. It's impossible to choose, you know, our top favorite, but we're going to pull out some that we think have really special stories to share with you. Some of them you may have seen on a tour and just not really known their story, so we'll be highlighting that. That, again, that link for registering for the Zoom webinar is on our website, plymouthantiquarian.org, or you can always watch the program when it streams on Facebook. So that will be next month. I can't believe that we're already looking at June, but summer will be here before we know it, and it's great that we're still able to connect with everyone virtually. So I think that's it probably, since we're out of time, but thank you so much again, Kate, for coming and sharing your expertise with us and for walking us through all you've done, the wonderful work on these particular items in our collection. And so it's been wonderful to be able to have shown those dresses, and then the sampler as well, to know that it's ready to be preserved for many, many years to come. We're thankful that we can add it to our collection and continue to interpret local history and preserve the stories of these women in particular through their needlework.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's been a lot of fun, and I think it's really important to let people know that they can have a hand in this too. You know,
yes.
Work you can do with your own collection to keep it preserved. So.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have room for everyone's treasures, but it's nice to know that some things may remain in families where they have that personal connection to those objects. And it's wonderful to know that people can care for those objects in their own homes, as you've pointed out, just by doing a few things that will preserve them for the future. So look for that email with those resources. And if you're watching on the Facebook stream, you won't get an email from me, but visit our website, plymouthantiquarian.org, and you can find the recording, and then I'll add the resource page there right on our website, so you can download it from there. And it's plymouthantiquarian.org / lunchtime-conversations. That's the address. But look forward to seeing you all next month on June 9th. And thanks again, Kate. Have a great afternoon.
Yep, you too. Same to everybody. All right.
Bye.
Bye.